Welcome to White History for Sleep. Tonight, we begin an epic journey back to a time of profound transformation, a century that redefines the very fabric of human existence. Before we witness the shadow that fell over the world, we must first look upon the light that preceded it. Imagine, if you will, the early 1300s. Europe and Asia are connected by threads of trade and faith, moving to a rhythm that had remained unchanged for generations. Close your eyes and let the sounds of a medieval evening settle around you. The distant, rhythmic tolling of cathedral bells marks the end of the working day, a sound that provides the heartbeat of the community. In the small villages scattered across the English countryside and the French plains, the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Families gather around stone hearths, the flickering amber light of the fire dancing on walls of wattle and daub. This is a world of deep, predictable cycles, the sowing of seeds in the spring, the golden labor of the harvest in autumn, and the quiet, introspective stillness of winter. Life is hard, governed by the strength of one's back and the mercy of the weather, but it is a life understood through a sense of divine order. To the east, the great Silk Road stretches like a golden vein across the vast steppes of Central Asia. Under the Pax Mongolica, caravans laden with shimmering silks, pungent spices, and delicate ceramics travel thousands of miles in relative safety. These merchants are the connectors of worlds. Moving between the bustling markets of Samarkand and the rising ports of the Mediterranean, it is a time of architectural wonder. Great Gothic cathedrals reach toward the heavens, their stained glass windows telling stories of salvation to a population that looks upward for hope. People believe that the world is a reflection of a higher, celestial harmony. The fields are green, the granaries are relatively full, and the population of Europe has reached a peak it has not seen since the height of the Roman Empire. There is a sense of stability, an equilibrium between the land and the people who toil upon it. But beneath this surface of peace, the first subtle shifts are occurring. The climate is beginning to cool, the long summers growing shorter, the rains more frequent and unforgiving. The Great Famine of 1315 has already left its mark on the collective memory, a whisper of vulnerability in a seemingly solid world. Yet, as the sun sets over the medieval horizon, no one can foresee that the greatest challenge to humanity is not coming from the sky, but from a microscopic passenger riding silently along the very trade routes that brought prosperity. The equilibrium is fragile, a delicate glass sculpture about to be shattered by a force so invisible and so relentless that it will be seen as the very hand of the apocalypse. Tonight, let the warmth of your surroundings protect you from the coming chill of history. Rest in the knowledge that this world, though distant and fraught with mystery, is the foundation of our own. As you drift into a deep, peaceful sleep, envision the quiet streets of a 14th century town, unaware that the wind carries the first distant echoes of a name that will be whispered in terror for centuries, the Black Death. Deep in the heart of the Eurasian continent, where the vast emerald grasslands of the steppes meet an infinite horizon, a silent shadow was beginning to stir. The year is 1338, and we find ourselves near the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul in the rugged mountains of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Here, the air is thin and crisp, carrying the scent of wild herbs and the distant echo of nomadic life. In this remote corner of the world, a microscopic predator had lived for millennia in a delicate, hidden equilibrium. Within the thick, warm fur of the wild marmots and the burrowing rodents of the plains, the bacterium Yersinia pestis waited. It was a hitchhiker, residing in the guts of tiny fleas that fed on these animals. For centuries, this biological cycle remained isolated, far from the bustling cities of man. But as the climate shifted and the rains failed, the rodents were forced from their ancestral burrows in search of food, bringing them into closer contact with the human settlements that dotted the Silk Road. Imagine a merchant caravan resting at a caravanserai, a desert inn made of sun-baked brick. The camels are kneeling in the dust, their heavy loads of silk, fur, and grain finally settled for the night. The merchants sit around a low fire, sharing stories of the long road from China. They do not see the small, dark shapes scurrying among the grain sacks. They do not feel the tiny, sharp bites of the fleas that have jumped from a dying marmot to a warm human host. This was the moment the spark was lit. The plague did not announce itself with thunder or fire. It arrived as a silent guest, traveling at the slow, rhythmic pace of the caravan. By 1339, the quiet graveyards near Isikkul began to fill with unprecedented speed. Archaeologists centuries later would find a sudden cluster of headstones from this exact year, their inscriptions speaking of a mysterious, swift pestilence that took young and old alike. From these mountain passes, the invisible killer hitched a ride on the very veins of global commerce. It moved westward, oasis by oasis, town by town. It passed through the great golden city of Samarkand, where the turquoise domes shimmered under a sun that now seemed to watch a growing tragedy. It followed the winding tracks toward the Caspian Sea, fueled by the connectivity of the Mongol Empire. To the people of the time, the deaths seemed like a localized curse, a distant misfortune of the eastern lands. They could not possibly understand that the world was more connected than ever before, and that this connectivity was now a bridge for a nightmare. The silent traveler was patient, feeding on the vitality of the Silk Road, turning the routes of prosperity into a map of encroaching darkness. As you sink deeper into the stillness of your room, envision the long, slow march of those caravans under the vast starlight of the desert, oblivious to the microscopic cargo they carried toward the unsuspecting heart of the West. The shadow was moving, and it would not stop until it reached the edge of the known world. Rest in the quiet of the night, while the echoes of the desert wind tell the tale of a spark that became a conflagration.
The Silk Road was like a huge blood vessel connecting different civilizations, languages, and beliefs at that time. But unfortunately, life was no longer flowing in these veins, but history's greatest destruction. As the caravan slowly advanced towards those vast steppes under the rule of the Golden Horde state, the plague was finding new victims with them in every accommodation, every caravanserai, and every night at the campfire. The city of Sarai, one of the most magnificent trade centers of the period, was filled with merchants, dervishes, and adventurers from all over the world. In the narrow and crowded streets of these cities and in the marketplaces blended with the pungent smells of spice shops, people were still preparing for the coming winter and bargaining in detail for the goods they brought from distant cities. But in the middle of this lively crowd and glittering commerce, there were tiny and deadly visitors that no one could even imagine existed. Mice hiding in precious furs, nesting deep in grain sacks, and fleas hiding among their fur, carrying poison that could extinguish a life with each bite. These fleas were actually unknowingly radically changing the course of history as they passed from one caravan to another, from an innkeeper to a traveler. People suddenly start getting sick for no reason. In the grip of a high fever and unbearable weakness, they fell into bed without understanding what was happening.
Those ominous swellings, namely bubons, that appeared on their bodies within a few days were the harbinger of an irreversible end. Abandoned campfires on the caravan routes, abandoned camels wandering in the middle of the steppe, and caravanserais shrouded in deep silence were increasing day by day. This invisible wind blowing from east to west had now crossed the northern shores of the Caspian Sea and reached the strategic gates of the Black Sea. This enemy, which grows stronger with every step, destroys the seemingly strongest but actually weakest aspects of civilization. In other words, he was using people's endless passion for trade and their inevitable need for each other as a weapon. A small flea hidden in a merchant's bag, perhaps among the folds of his most valuable silk, was about to seal the fate of an entire continent, Europe, by crossing thousands of kilometers without any obstacle. Now imagine traveling with a slowly moving caravan on the star-studded but misty roads of that period. All around you is the whisper of the wind drifting on the sand and the howls of coyotes in the distance. This silence is actually the silence of a big storm. In the next chapter, we will see how this dark journey reached the seas, how the first and most terrible biological warfare in history began in the siege of Caffe on the Crimean coast, and how the ships actually carried death as they left the ports. But now, leave yourself to the peaceful yet sad silence of this endless steppe. Surrender to the embrace of a safe and peaceful sleep while the whispers, fur, and grain finally settled for the night. The merchants sit around a low fire, sharing stories of the long road from China. They do not see the small, dark shapes scurrying among the grain sacks. They do not feel the tiny, sharp bites of the fleas that have jumped from a dying marmot to a warm human host. This was the moment the spark was lit. The plague did not announce itself with thunder or fire. It arrived as a silent guest, traveling at the slow, rhythmic pace of the caravan. By 1339, the quiet graveyards near Isikkul began to fill with unprecedented speed. Archaeologists centuries later would find a sudden cluster of headstones from this exact year, their inscriptions speaking of a mysterious, swift pestilence that took young and old alike. From these mountain passes, the invisible killer hitched a ride on the very veins of global commerce. It moved westward, oasis by oasis, town by town. It passed through the great golden city of Samarkand, where the turquoise domes shimmered under a sun that now seemed to watch a growing tragedy. It followed the winding tracks toward the Caspian Sea, fueled by the connectivity of the Mongol Empire. To the people of the time, the deaths seemed like a localized curse, a distant misfortune of the eastern lands. They could not possibly understand that the world was more connected than ever before, and that this connectivity was now a bridge for a nightmare. The silent traveler was patient, feeding on the vitality of the Silk Road.
Imagine the cold, salt-laden winds of the Black Sea whipping against the high, sturdy stone walls of Caffe, a thriving Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula. It is 1346, and within these walls, the merchants of Genoa feel a sense of precarious security. Their ships bobbing in the harbor, ready to carry the riches of the East back to the glittering Mediterranean. But outside the gates, the horizon is choked with the dust of the Golden Horde. The Mongol army, led by Janibeg, has laid siege to the city, cutting off the land routes and waiting for the defenders to wither. However, a silent and invisible ally has joined the Mongol ranks, one that knows no allegiance. The plague that had been creeping across the steppes finally caught up with the besiegers. In the Mongol camp, the air turned sour with the smell of decay. Soldiers who had conquered vast territories were now falling not to arrows or steel, but to an internal fire they could not quench. They were dying in such numbers that the siege began to collapse from within. But Janibeg, in a final, desperate act of spite and calculated horror, decided that if his army was to perish, the city would perish with them. History records this as one of the earliest and most terrifying instances of biological warfare. Imagine the sound of the great wooden trebuchets creaking in the night, the heavy counterweights swinging as they were prepared not for boulders, but for something far more gruesome. The Mongols began to catapult the infected corpses of their own dead over the city walls. In the dim light of dawn, the citizens of Caffe watched in paralyzed horror as a rain of dead souls fell from the sky, crashing onto the streets and rooftops. The bodies were bloated and black with the marks of the pestilence. The air within the confined city soon became thick with the miasma of rot. Though the Genoese tried to dispose of the bodies by throwing them into the sea, the invisible contagion had already taken hold. The water, the air, and the very ground of Caffe were now saturated with the seeds of the Black Death. Panic replaced the order of trade. The survivors, desperate to escape the charnel house the city had become, rushed to their galleys. They unfurled their sails and rowed with frantic strength away from the Crimean coast, believing they were leaving the nightmare behind. But as the ships cut through the dark waves toward Sicily, Italy, and France, they were not just carrying silk and spices. They were carrying the end of the medieval world in their holds. The infected rats scurried between the timber, and the sailors, unknowingly harboring the bacteria, looked back at the receding shoreline of Caffe, unaware that they were the messengers of an apocalypse. As you settle into the safety of your own space, let the image of those distant, flickering ship lights on the midnight sea guide you into a deep rest. The journey of the plague had transitioned from the dust of the road to the salt of the deep, and the world would never be the same again.
Close your eyes and imagine the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the Mediterranean Sea in the autumn of 1347. The water is a deep, tranquil azure, shimmering under a fading October sun. From a distance, a fleet of 12 Genoese galleys appears on the horizon, their sails billowing softly in the Mediterranean breeze. To anyone standing on the shores of Messina, Sicily, it looks like a routine arrival of wealth and prosperity. But as the ships draw closer, a chilling silence hangs over them. There are no shouts from the deck, no rhythmic chanting of the oarsmen, only the creak of timber and the snap of canvas. When the galleys finally drift into the harbor and bump against the stone quays, the welcoming crowds are met with a sight that will haunt the memory of Europe forever. Most of the sailors are already dead, their bodies slumped over oars or tangled in the rigging. The few who remain alive are unrecognizable, their skin turned a bruised, sickly purple, their bodies covered in the agonizing black swellings known as buboes. They are too weak to speak, their eyes filled with a hollow, pleading terror. The authorities in Messina, gripped by an immediate and primal fear, realize too late that these are not merchant ships, but floating tombs. Even as they try to drive the galleys back out to sea, the invisible inhabitants of the ships have already begun their own invasion. While the dying sailors are gasping their last breaths, the black rats that lived in the holds are scurrying down the thick mooring ropes, disappearing into the dark, crowded alleys of the port.
With them go the fleas, the silent vectors of a microscopic doom, carrying the Yersinia pestis from the holds of the ships into the heart of the city. The people of Messina, initially moved by pity and then by absolute panic, have no way of knowing that the simple act of breathing the same air or touching a discarded piece of cloth is enough to seal their fate. Within days, the pestilence explodes within the city walls. The bells of Messina, which usually rang for prayer and celebration, begin to toll a constant, mournful dirge for the hundreds falling every hour. The vibrant port, once a gateway of life, has become the gateway of the Black Death. From this single point of contact, the shadow will begin its relentless climb up the boot of Italy, spreading like a drop of ink in a glass of clear water. As you drift toward a peaceful sleep, imagine those ships drifting away into the mist, a somber reminder of how a single moment in time can change the course of human history. The harbor is quiet now, the water still, as we prepare to see how the continent of Europe will face its darkest winter. Rest well, knowing the story is safely in the past, and let the rhythmic sound of the waves carry you into your dreams.
In the mid-1300s, medicine was a blend of ancient philosophy, astrology, and deep-seated religious belief. The most learned doctors looked not at the ground or at the rats, but at the stars. In 1348, the medical faculty of the University of Paris, the most prestigious in the world, concluded that the plague was caused by a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius. This celestial event, they believed, had poisoned the atmosphere, creating a toxic vapor that entered the body through the pores. The air was the enemy. To combat this, cities were transformed into smoky landscapes. Authorities ordered great bonfires to be lit at every crossroads, fueled by aromatic woods like juniper and ash, hoping to cleanse the sky. People walked the streets clutching pomanders, small perforated balls filled with ambergris, musk, or dried roses, holding them to their noses to block out the evil air. There was a tragic irony in this. While they sought to block out smells, the true vectors of the disease, the fleas, were jumping silently between their clothes, unnoticed. Inside the dark, cramped surgeries, the cures were often as terrifying as the disease. Doctors, following the ancient teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, believed the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness meant these humors were out of balance. To fix this, they turned to bloodletting, draining the life force of patients already weakened by the fever. They applied leeches to the skin or used hot cups to draw out the poisons.
They lanced the painful buboes, those swollen lymph nodes in the neck and groin, often with red-hot irons, unintentional acts of torture in a desperate attempt to let the sickness out. They tried everything. Some doctors prescribed drinking crushed emeralds or eating theorak, a complex paste made of over 60 ingredients, including snake flesh and opium. Others suggested sitting in the heat of a massive oven to sweat out the plague. There was a profound sense of helplessness. The best advice given by the most famous doctors of the era was often the simplest. Cito longe tarde. Fly quickly, go far, and return slowly. As you breathe in the cool, clean air of the present, feel the immense weight of that historical confusion lift away. We know the invisible now. We understand the microscopic. Let the image of those flickering medieval fires fade into the soft shadows of your room. The world was searching for answers in the stars and the smoke. But for tonight, you have found the only answer that matters. Rest. Sleep deeply, knowing that the poisoned air of the past is nothing but a distant whisper in the annals of time. In Florence, the plague did not just take lives, it shattered the very foundation of human society. Imagine the silence that has fallen over the once thundering markets of the Piazza della Signoria. The looms of the wool merchants have gone still. The laughter that once echoed from the stone palazzos has been replaced by a heavy, suffocating dread. The great writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the horror firsthand, famously wrote that the pestilence was so swift and so cruel that citizens avoided each other, neighbors settled apart, and even relations rarely or never visited each other. This was the most heartbreaking aspect of the Italian experience, the breaking of the sacred bond. In a world defined by family and faith, the Black Death forced a cruel choice. Mothers abandoned their children, husbands fled from their wives. The fear of the poisoned air and the touch of the infected became so absolute that the basic instincts of human compassion began to wither. To the medieval mind, this was the ultimate sign of the apocalypse. Not just that people were dying, but that they were dying alone, without the comfort of kin or the last rites of the church. As the death toll climbed to hundreds, then thousands per day, the ancient rituals of burial collapsed. There were no more funeral processions, no more mourning bells, for the bells had been silenced to prevent the constant tolling from driving the survivors mad. Great trenches were dug outside the city walls, layered with bodies like cheese in a lasagna, as one chronicler grimly described. The dignity of the individual was lost in the sheer, overwhelming volume of the dead.
Yet, even in this darkness, the city remained hauntingly beautiful under the Tuscan sun. The cypress trees still swayed in the breeze, and the Arno River flowed quietly under the bridges, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in the streets above. This contrast between the eternal beauty of nature and the fragile mortality of man is the essence of the Florentine spring of 1348. Boccaccio noted a strange psychological shift among the survivors.
Some retreated into prayer and asceticism, while others, believing the world was ending, decided to live their final days in a fever of indulgence, drinking and feasting in the abandoned houses of the dead. It was a city caught between the extremes of despair and defiance. As you listen to the quiet rhythm of your own breath, feel the peace of your safety. The chaos of 1348 Florence is a distant echo, a story written in old ink on weathered parchment. The bonds that were broken then have long since been mended by history. Let the image of the quiet, sun-drenched hills of Tuscany carry you into a restful sleep. The world has moved on, and for tonight, the only journey you need to take is the one into the soft, welcoming embrace of your dreams. Sleep now, while the stars watch over a world that found its way through the dark.
The Palais des Papes, a massive Gothic fortress of golden stone, stands as a symbol of spiritual and temporal power, yet even its thick walls cannot keep out the invisible intruder. Inside, Pope Clement VI watches in horror as his own household begins to wither. The plague in Avignon is particularly virulent. It is here that we begin to see the emergence of the pneumonic strain, which attacks the lungs and spreads through the very breath of the afflicted, killing with a speed that defies comprehension. The Pope's personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, one of the most brilliant medical minds of the age, realizes that traditional medicine is failing. He observes that even the touch of a garment or the glance of a dying man seems to carry the seeds of death. To protect the Vicar of Christ, de Chauliac orders a radical and atmospheric defense. He commands that 2 massive fires be kept burning night and day in the Pope's private chambers. Imagine the scene, the heat of a Provençal summer made even more intense by the roaring flames of aromatic pine and laurel. The Pope sits between these 2 pillars of fire, draped in heavy robes, breathing in the scorched, smoky air as a barrier against the poisoned miasma outside. In a strange twist of fate that the medieval mind could not understand, this method likely saved him, not because it purified the air, but because the intense heat and smoke kept the fleas away. Outside the palace, the city of Avignon has become a charnel house. The Rhone River is so choked with corpses that the Pope is forced to consecrate the entire river as sacred ground, allowing the dead to be cast into the water with a final blessing. This act of desperate compassion illustrates the total collapse of the social and religious order. Yet, while others flee, de Chauliac stays, recording the symptoms with clinical precision and eventually surviving a bout of the plague himself. He becomes one of our most important witnesses to the darkness, a man of science trying to light a candle in a world where the sun seems to have set. As you rest in the cool stillness of your own room, imagine those flickering papal fires, their orange glow reflecting off the cold stone walls of history. The heat of that long-ago summer has faded, and the smoke has cleared, leaving only the quiet peace of the present. Feel the safety of your surroundings as the image of the golden fortress of Avignon dissolves into the soft shadows of sleep. The world was burning then to stay alive, but tonight you are safe, protected by the passage of time. Sleep deeply and let the rhythmic flow of the Rhone carry your thoughts into the tranquil sea of dreams, far away from the struggles of the past. The shadow is moving north, toward the white cliffs of an island that believes itself safe, but for now there is only the warmth of your bed and the silence of the stars. The horrors experienced in the interior of the continent were a divine punishment unique to the French,
until the first ship docked at the port. When the ship was tied to the dock, most of the sailors on board had already perished, and those who survived were struggling with vomiting and high fever. Once the plague set foot on British soil, it spread rapidly as it did throughout the rest of Europe. It spread like wildfire from Dorset to Somerset and then to London, the heart of the country. At that time, the city was a mouse paradise with its narrow streets, open sewers, and wooden houses. While sacks of grain were being unloaded on the docks on the banks of the Thames River, black mice jumped out and scattered throughout the labyrinth-like streets of London. At the beginning of 1349, London fell into complete chaos. Parliament could no longer meet, the courts were closed, and the royal family fled the city and sought refuge in castles in the countryside. But running away was not a solution, because the disease could overcome not only poor neighborhoods, but even the most protected castles. Even the thick walls of the Tower of London were not enough to stop the invisible killer.
While the people were trying to understand the cause of this disaster, the churches were overflowing, but the clergy were also dying along with the people. Every morning on the streets they chanted, "Bring out your dead." Their voices echoed. Corpse collectors filled their cars and drove towards the huge mass graves newly dug in the city. The green valleys of England were beginning to be filled with quiet and deserted villages. Crops were rotting in the fields, animals were wandering, and life was coming to a halt. People were so sure that the world was about to end that they put aside all their plans for the future. Now imagine the silence of this foggy and misty medieval England. The noise on the streets has stopped. Only the howling of the wind in the windows of empty houses remains. The sadness of this distant past echoes only as a story in your present, safe and peaceful room. All the chaos of the outside world and the heavy burden of history are far away from you. Now take your mind off these foggy English shores and focus on the softness of your own bed. All the storms of the past have passed, and only the calming silence of the night remains. As you surrender yourself to the deep and healing arms of sleep, just feel the peace and security.
Those deadly ships arriving in London's ports turned not only the Dorset coast, but the entire city along the River Thames into a graveyard. By the spring of 1349, London was no longer the trading center of Britain, but a massive quarantine zone. Walking through the narrow streets of the city was now equivalent to feeling the cold breath of death on your neck. The population of London at the time was around 50,000 people, and every day hundreds of people were suddenly collapsing without any symptoms. The royal family and nobles attempted to flee to their rural estates outside the walls surrounding the city, but the plague was quicker than them. King III Edward's daughter, Princess Joan, was on her way to Spain to get married. She fell into the grip of the plague in Bordeaux and died within the palace walls. This incident became the most painful proof that the disease listens neither to social status nor to nobility. Chaos within the city reached such a level that traditional cemeteries were filled to capacity within a few weeks. There was no more room in the churchyards for the new dead. The Bishop of London then purchased huge tracts of land in East Smithfield and Charterhouse, just outside the city, as an emergency cemetery. The excavations carried out by archaeologists in these regions centuries later would reveal the horror of those days in all their nakedness. Thousands of skeletons were buried parallel to each other and on top of each other with great care but in great haste, as if books were lined up on the shelves of a library. People couldn't even find time to say goodbye to their loved ones, leaving only a deep loneliness as corpse collectors passed through the streets in their cars in the middle of the night. The fall of London destroyed not only the demographic structure of England, but also its psychological world. Belief systems began to shake. The question of why God did not protect even the most religious people from this disaster became the biggest cry echoing in people's minds. Shops in the city closed, legal systems stopped, and the economy was completely paralyzed. London was going through one of the darkest periods in its history, but this darkness would not be limited to just one island. The movement of English armies with their plague towards the Scottish border and Scandinavian ports determined the next stop of the disaster. Now imagine those foggy and abandoned streets of London slowly becoming silent. The waters of the River Thames now flow past the once lively docks, accompanied only by the creaking of empty ships. This heavy and sad curtain of history is just a whisper in your current quiet and peaceful environment. All the great tragedies of the past are over, and only the soothing coolness of the night remains. As you leave yourself in the safe harbor of sleep, let all the thoughts in your mind flow away like those old river waters. You are safe, the night is calm, and everything is peaceful as it should be.
The collapse of London was merely the prologue to the devastation of the British Isles. As the southern counties of England withered under the plague, the Scots to the north watched with a mixture of horror and opportunistic calculation. Believing the pestilence to be a foul death of the English, a divine punishment specifically aimed at their traditional rivals, the Scottish army gathered in the Selkirk Forest in 1349. Their plan was to invade the weakened borderlands and reclaim territories while England was paralyzed. However, as the soldiers mobilized, the silent passenger moved with them. Before they could launch a full-scale assault, the plague erupted within the Scottish ranks. Thousands died in their camps before they could even draw their swords. The retreating survivors carried the infection back to the towns of Edinburgh and Perth, proving that the invisible killer recognized no political borders and shared no national allegiances. As the plague gripped the Scottish Highlands, it simultaneously turned its gaze toward the freezing waters of the North Sea. In the summer of 1349, a ghost ship departed from London, destined for Norway. It was a merchant vessel carrying wool and grain, but its crew was already marked for death. By the time the ship reached the port of Bergen, every man on board was dead or dying. The local authorities, curious and unsuspecting, boarded the vessel to claim the cargo.
While the people were trying to understand the cause of this disaster, the churches were overflowing, but the clergy were also dying along with the people. Every morning on the streets they chanted, "Bring out your dead!" Their voices echoed. Corpse collectors filled their cars and drove towards the huge mass graves newly dug in the city. The green valleys of England were beginning to be filled with quiet and deserted villages. Crops were rotting in the fields, animals were wandering, and life was coming to a halt. People were so sure that the world was about to end that they put aside all their plans for the future. Now imagine the silence of this foggy and misty medieval England. The noise on the streets has stopped. Only the howling of the wind in the windows of empty houses remains. The sadness of this distant past echoes only as a story in your present, safe and peaceful room. All the chaos of the outside world and the heavy burden of history are far away from you. Now take your mind off these foggy English shores and focus on the softness of your own bed. All the storms of the past have passed, and only the calming silence of the night remains. As you surrender yourself to the deep and healing arms of sleep, just feel the peace and security The pestilence, having completed its devastating circuit through the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, turned its icy gaze toward the vast, untamed plains of the east. By 1351, the plague had reached the great trading hubs of northwestern Russia, specifically the powerful merchant republic of Pskov. The Black Death entered the city gates not with a roar, but with a whisper, hidden in the thick fur coats of traders coming from the Baltic. The chroniclers of the time describe a scene of unimaginable despair. People died so suddenly that the living could not keep pace with the burials. In Pskov and later in Great Novgorod, the dead were piled in massive pits, 20 or 30 deep, as the panicked citizens built one-day churches, small wooden structures erected in a single day as a desperate offering to God to stay the hand of the angel of death. From the northern republics, the shadow crept southward toward the rising power of Moscow. The Grand Prince of Moscow, Simeon the Proud, watched as the contagion bypassed his stone defenses and entered his private chambers. In 1353, both the prince and his 2 sons were claimed by the plague, leaving the throne in a state of sudden, shivering vulnerability. The Russian winter, usually a protector against invaders, offered no sanctuary. The bacteria simply waited in the warmth of the crowded wooden izba huts. The plague had now traveled thousands of miles, effectively completing a massive, lethal loop that had begun in the steppes of Central Asia nearly 2 decades earlier. The world was now fully enclosed in a ring of mourning, from the Atlantic to the Urals.
This period marked the physical limit of the first great wave. The Black Death had reshaped the map of the East, thinning the ranks of the nobility and the peasantry alike, and setting the stage for a new political order to rise from the ashes of the old principalities. The great forests of Russia fell silent, the smoke of funeral pyres blending with the gray mists of the Volga River. The invisible traveler had finished its primary journey, leaving behind a world that was significantly emptier, quieter, and fundamentally altered in its soul. Visualize the vast snow-covered plains of the Russian wilderness under a pale winter moon. The distant howling of wolves is the only sound in a landscape that has forgotten the noise of the marketplace. The heavy silver silence of the snow acts as a blanket, smoothing over the scars of the past and bringing a profound stillness to the earth. This ancient winter has long since thawed, and the world has been reborn many times over. Feel the warmth of your current surroundings as a stark, comforting contrast to the cold winds of the 14th century. Your mind is now a sanctuary of peace, distant from the movements of history. Let the rhythmic, slow pace of this narrative lull you into a state of heavy relaxation. The long journey across the continents is over for tonight, and all that remains is the tranquil, steady heartbeat of the night. Sink into the depths of your rest, drifting away into a world where the only frontier is the soft landscape of your dreams.
The unseen mechanics of death. As the plague completed its grim circuit across the continents, the medieval mind remained trapped in a fog of superstition. Yet the true mechanics of the catastrophe were far more systematic and ruthless than any curse. To understand how 90,000 characters of history could be written by a single organism, we must look into the microscopic engine of the Black Death, Yersinia pestis. This bacterium did not act alone. It was part of a lethal trinity consisting of the rodent, the flea, and the microbe. In the overcrowded, timber-framed houses of 14th-century Europe, the black rat, or Rattus rattus, was a constant, albeit unwelcome, companion. These rats lived in the thatch of roofs, the grain stores, and the holds of ships, providing the perfect transport for the true executioner, the oriental rat flea. When a rat died from the infection, its body cooled, forcing the fleas to seek a new warm host, often the unsuspecting human sleeping nearby. The flea's gut would become blocked by a biofilm of bacteria, making it perpetually hungry and forcing it to bite repeatedly, vomiting the lethal pathogen into the human bloodstream with every strike. Once inside the human body, the bacteria raced to the nearest lymph nodes, causing them to swell into the agonizing egg-sized buboes that gave the bubonic plague its name. But the horror did not stop there. In the cold, damp air of the north, the bacteria often migrated to the lungs, creating the pneumonic strain. This version was even more terrifying, as it transformed every cough and every breath into a weapon, allowing the plague to leap from person to person without the need for fleas or rats. The speed of transmission was so absolute that a person could be healthy at breakfast and a corpse by dinner. This biological efficiency explains why the social structures we have discussed, the families of Florence, the courts of London, and the markets of Russia, collapsed so utterly. The enemy was invisible, airborne, and relentless, turning the very act of human companionship into a death sentence. Now imagine the microscopic world settling into a state of dormancy, the frantic movement of the bacteria slowing down as the fires of the past burn out. The intricate, dangerous clockwork of the 14th century has long since ceased to tick, replaced by the smooth, quiet machinery of the modern world. Feel the profound stillness of your own body, safe and untouched by the chaotic biological storms of the Middle Ages. The air you breathe is clear, the night is calm, and the heavy weight of history is serving only to anchor you deeper into the comfort of your bed. Let the technical complexities of the past dissolve into a simple, rhythmic pulse of relaxation. As you drift away, the microscopic and the monumental both fade into the soft, gray edges of sleep, leaving you in a sanctuary of total peace and silent rest.
The Plague Doctor's Vigil. With the biological engine of the pestilence running at full throttle across Europe, a new and haunting figure began to emerge from the smoke of the funeral pyres: the Plague Doctor. Though the iconic bird-like mask is often associated with later centuries, the concept of the specialized physician arose from the sheer desperation of the 1350s. Imagine a figure draped in a long, heavy coat of leather or waxed canvas, designed to be a barrier against the miasma that everyone believed carried the seeds of death. Their most striking feature was the primitive respirator, a mask with a long curved beak filled with aromatic herbs like cinnamon, cloves, and dried roses. To the terrified citizens, these doctors looked less like healers and more like harbingers of the underworld, giant ravens stalking through the silent, plague-stricken streets. They carried long wooden canes used to examine patients without touching them and to push away the desperate crowds that begged for a miracle they did not possess. These doctors were often community physicians hired by cities to treat the poor and the rich alike, yet their presence usually signaled that a neighborhood was beyond hope.
They moved through the darkness of shuttered houses, their goggles reflecting the dim candlelight as they performed gruesome tasks, lancing buboes with hot irons or prescribing cures made of ground sunlight and vinegar. Despite their terrifying appearance, they were the only ones who stayed when the priests and the lawyers fled. They became the grim bookkeepers of the apocalypse, recording the names of the dead in leather-bound ledgers that would eventually— Suffocating world for the doctor, a sensory wall between them and the stench of the dying city. This isolation was a precursor to the modern quarantine, a recognition that to survive the shadow, one had to remain apart from it. Now, let the image of that dark, heavy robe and the scent of dried lavender fade into the background of your mind. The frightening silhouettes of the past have been replaced by the soft, familiar shadows of your own room, where you are safe and undisturbed. The long wooden cane of the plague doctor is silent now, and the heavy leather coat has crumbled into the dust of centuries. Feel the lightness of your own breath, free from the smoke and the herbs of the medieval streets. As you settle deeper into your pillow, allow the quiet vigilance of history to transform into a protective shield of calm. The world of the 14th century is a closed book, and you are resting in the peaceful silence that follows the final word. Let the rhythmic, steady pulse of the night carry you into a sleep where no shadows can reach, leaving only the warmth and the stillness of the present. The Symphony of the Lash. As the plague deepened its hold, the collective psyche of Europe began to fracture under the weight of an unanswerable question: why? In the absence of scientific understanding, thousands turned toward a radical, rhythmic, and haunting form of penance. These were the flagellants, processions of hundreds of men and women who traveled from town to town, dressed in somber robes marked with red crosses. Imagine the sound of their approach, not a roar, but a low,
droning chant of hymns punctuated by the rhythmic, wet thud of leather whips tipped with iron spikes. They believed that by recreating the suffering of Christ on their own bodies, they could appease a divine wrath and halt the pestilence. In every market square they entered, they formed massive circles, lying face down in the dirt according to the sins they sought to purge, before rising to lash their own backs in a synchronized display of agony. To the terrified onlookers, this was a spectacular and desperate theater of faith. They would dip their garments in the blood of the flagellants, believing it possessed a holy power to ward off the poisoned air. However, these processions inadvertently became the very thing they tried to stop. Moving from city to city, the flagellants carried the fleas in their woolen robes and the bacteria in their open wounds, acting as unintended couriers of the Black Death. By the time the Pope and kings realized the social chaos these groups were causing, fueling hysteria and challenging the authority of the Church, the movement had already left a trail of blood and infection across the heart of Europe. The movement eventually flickered out as the participants succumbed to the very plague they tried to whip away, leaving the town squares silent once more.
The universal leveler. As the mid-1350s approached, the sheer scale of the mortality gave birth to a new and haunting artistic obsession, the danse macabre, or the dance of death. In the mind of the medieval survivor, death was no longer a distant event, but a constant, grinning companion. This was the era where the skeleton became a central figure in the human imagination. Imagine walking into a candlelit stone chapel where the walls are covered in fresh frescoes depicting emperors, bishops, merchants, and peasants, all joined in a frantic circular dance. Beside each living figure is a skeletal version of themselves, tugging at their sleeves, leading them toward an inevitable grave. This imagery served as a grim reminder of memento mori, remember that you will die. The Black Death was the great leveler, a force that cared nothing for the velvet robes of a king or the rags of a beggar. It shattered the social hierarchy of the Middle Ages, proving that under the skin, all were the same. This cultural shift changed how people lived. Since life was seen as a fleeting vapor, some clung more fiercely to their gold, while others abandoned all worldly ambition. The obsession with the physical reality of death, the bones, the tombs, and the decay, became a way for the collective mind to process the trauma of losing half the world's population. Every chime of a clock and every shadow on the wall was seen as a skeletal hand beckoning. Yet there was a strange, dark comfort in this equality. The plague had shown that no one was truly alone in their vulnerability. Now let the image of that ancient, rhythmic dance slow down until the figures are still and silent.
The rattling of bones and the warnings of the frescoes are nothing more than echoes trapped in the dust of old cathedrals. The world you inhabit tonight is not one of shadows and skeletons, but one of softness and security. The dance of death has ended, and in its place is the quiet, steady breath of life. Feel your own limbs grow heavy and warm, sinking into a state of total rest that the medieval world could only dream of. The labels of the day, your work, your status, your worries are falling away, leaving only the peaceful essence of your being. As the flickering candlelight of history goes out, you are left in the protective embrace of the dark. Sleep deeply, drifting into a realm where time has no power, and the only rhythm is the gentle, slow tide of your dreams. The Black Death had not only taken the people, but had broken the ancient relationship between man and the land. Imagine standing on a hillside in the English Midlands or the French countryside in 1352. The vast open fields that were once teeming with the activity of hundreds of serfs are now overgrown with weeds and brambles. The oxen wander aimlessly through the tall grass, their yokes long since rotted away, as there are no hands left to guide the plow. This was the phenomenon of the deserted medieval village. Entire hamlets were left completely empty. The stone cottages stood with their doors swinging in the wind, their hearths cold and their roofs collapsing under the weight of the rain. The silence was absolute. In some places, the forest began to reclaim the land.
The trees marching back into the furrows that had been cultivated for centuries. For the survivors, this emptiness was both a tragedy and a strange, terrifying opportunity. With so few laborers left alive, the value of a single human's work skyrocketed. The surviving peasants, who for generations had been tied to the soil as little more than property, began to realize that their hands were now worth more than the land itself. This was the beginning of the end for the feudal system. The iron grip of the lords was slipping because the silent rows of the dead had left the remaining living with the power to demand more. The world was physically changing, The very air felt different in these vast, unpeopled spaces. The dense, crowded atmosphere of the high Middle Ages had been replaced by a haunting, spacious loneliness. Now let the image of those empty, overgrown fields bring a sense of profound quiet to your mind. The frantic labor of the past is over, and the land has found its own way back to a state of natural rest. The abandoned villages have long since become part of the earth, their stories buried safely beneath the grass you walk upon. Feel the stillness of the countryside entering your own room, washing away the noise of the modern world. You are not required to toil or to plan. Like the earth in winter, your only job is to be still and to recover. As the shadows of the old forests grow long and soft, let them wrap around you like a heavy, warm blanket. You are drifting into a place of deep, undisturbed peace, where the world is quiet, and the only sound is the gentle, distant whisper of the wind through the trees. Sleep now, and let the silence of history guide you into the deepest part of the night.
The death of feudalism. As the fields stood empty and the manors grew silent, the invisible hand of the plague began to tear at the very foundations of medieval power. For centuries, the great chain of being had dictated that everyone had a fixed place, the lord in his castle, the priest in his church, and the peasant bound to the soil. But the Black Death was a radical equalizer that broke these ancient links. Imagine a surviving serf in 1353 standing amidst the ruins of his village, realizing for the first time that his labor was no longer a forced obligation, but a precious commodity. With a massive shortage of hands to harvest the grain or shear the sheep, the remaining workers began to walk away from their ancestral lands, seeking higher wages elsewhere, a concept that was nearly unthinkable just a decade prior. The lords, desperate to keep their estates from returning to the wilderness, were forced to offer coin instead of just protection, and freedom instead of just survival. In England, the government tried to freeze time with the Statute of Laborers, a desperate law demanding that wages return to pre-plague levels, but the tide of history could not be turned back by ink and parchment. The psychological wall had crumbled. The peasants had seen their masters die just as miserably as the beggars in the ditch. This shift in power created a new restless energy in the air, a precursor to the social uprisings that would soon follow.
Feel the freedom in your own stillness, the luxury of a moment where nothing is demanded of you. You are not bound by the cycles of the sun or the demands of a master. You are simply a soul at rest in a safe, modern sanctuary. As you breathe in the cool, still air, let the weight of the day lift away, leaving you as light as a feather in the dark. The history of the world is a long, winding road, but for tonight, that road has reached a peaceful clearing. Sink into the velvet depths of your bed, and let the silence of the shifting ages lull you into a deep, restorative sleep. In England, the tension between the desperate ruling class and the newly empowered labor force snapped in 1381 during the Peasants' Rebellion. Imagine thousands of workers, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, marching on London with a radical question. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? They were demanding the total abolition of serfdom. For the first time in history, the common man realized that the social order was not a divine law, but a fragile construct that could be challenged. The plague had inadvertently taught them the value of their own lives. Similar fires of revolt ignited across Europe, the Jacquerie in France and the Ciompi revolt in Florence, as the working class sought to claim their share of the world that had nearly ended. Though many of these uprisings were brutally suppressed, the spark of individual agency had been lit. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled was permanently altered. The specter of the Black Death had created a world where the survivor was a person with a voice rather than just a cog in the feudal machine. Now let the echoes of those ancient shouts and the clatter of the march fade into the peaceful, silent night. The fires of rebellion have long since turned to ash, and the fields are at rest under the watchful stars. The struggle for a voice and the weight of social upheaval are far removed from the quiet comfort of your current space. Feel the soft, steady rhythm of the world as it breathes in its own state of peace. You are living in the quiet aftermath of centuries of change, reaping the simple luxury of a night where your only duty is to surrender to the stillness. Let your mind wander through the calm, empty landscapes of history, finding a place of deep, heavy relaxation. The world is secure, the stories are told, and the dark velvet of sleep is waiting to pull you into a dreamless, perfect rest. As the social hierarchy crumbled, the most powerful institution of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, faced a spiritual and structural earthquake from which it would never fully recover. During the height of the plague, the clergy had been on the front lines, and their mortality rate was staggeringly high. In many regions, nearly half of the priests, monks, and bishops perished while administering the last rites to the dying. Imagine the great stone cathedrals and secluded monasteries, once centers of learning and absolute authority, now echoing with an eerie emptiness. The loss of seasoned, educated leaders forced the Church to hastily ordain young, inexperienced, and often illiterate men to fill the void. This led to a sharp decline in the quality of spiritual guidance and a rise in corruption that deeply disillusioned the survivors. The common people, having seen their holy men die just as helplessly as the sinners,
began to question the Church's direct line to the divine. This skepticism planted the first seeds of the Reformation. If the institutional Church could not protect its own, perhaps the individual could find God without a mediator. The mystery of the Black Death had cracked the monopoly on truth, creating a spiritual vacuum that would eventually be filled by new ways of thinking. Now, let the image of those cold, silent cloisters and the flickering altar candles fade into the shadows of the past. The heavy scent of incense and the sound of distant, mournful chants are replaced by the clean, quiet air of your own sanctuary. The spiritual crises and the great debates of the 14th century are settled, resting peacefully within the pages of history. You are in a place of absolute safety, where no questions need answering and no rituals need performing. Feel the profound stillness of the night wrapping around you, a soft and protective barrier against the noise of time. The great stone walls of the past have turned to dust, leaving only the tranquil, steady pulse of your own heart. As you sink deeper into your bed, allow your mind to let go of every thread of the story, drifting into a space where there is only warmth, darkness, and the promise of a deep, uninterrupted rest.
The profound loss of life and the failure of ancient institutions to stop the plague eventually forced a radical shift in how humanity viewed its own existence. As the 14th century began to close, the survivors found themselves in a world with more resources but fewer people, leading to a strange and unexpected surge in innovation. Since labor was scarce, people began to invent machines, primitive water mills, better printing techniques, and improved navigational tools to do the work that the dead could no longer perform. This was the unintended gift of the Black Death, the birth of a more practical, human-centered world. In the silent palazzos of Italy, the focus shifted from the afterlife to the beauty and potential of the living. Artists began to study the human body with a new, clinical intensity, and scholars turned away from celestial mysteries to rediscover the forgotten wisdom of the Greeks and Romans. This intellectual awakening was the dawn of the Renaissance. The trauma of the plague had acted as a brutal pruning, allowing the remaining branches of civilization to grow stronger and reach toward the light of reason. The world was no longer just a waiting room for heaven. It was a canvas for human achievement, painted with the resilience of those who had looked into the abyss and survived.
Now, imagine the flickering candlelight of a scholar's desk slowly dimming, the heavy parchment being rolled up for the night. The frantic questions of the past have been answered by the steady progress of the centuries, and the world has found its balance once again. The great stone cities that once trembled under the shadow of the pestilence are now silent, peaceful monuments to human endurance. Feel the weight of those ancient struggles lifting away, leaving you in a state of light, effortless calm. You are resting in the fruit of that long-ago recovery, in a world that is bright, safe, and still. The air around you is quiet, the shadows in your room are soft and familiar, and the long road of history has led you here, to this moment of perfect, undisturbed peace. Sink into the warmth of your blankets, letting the stories of the past dissolve into the background. Your mind is clear, your body is heavy, and you are ready to drift into a deep, restorative sleep where the only light is the soft glow of your own dreams.
This period saw the birth of the lazaretto and the formal concept of the quarantine. In 1377, the port of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, passed a law requiring all travelers and merchants from plague-stricken areas to spend 30 days, a Trentine, isolated on a nearby island before entering the city. This was later extended to 40 days, giving us the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni. Imagine the coastal islands of the Adriatic and the lagoons of Venice, where massive, silent warehouses were built to house the suspected carriers. These were the first structured attempts to manage a biological crisis through administrative power. The cities themselves began to change. Streets were widened to allow air to circulate, and the Board of Health became a permanent fixture of urban life. The plague was forcing a transition from the chaotic, organic growth of medieval towns to the organized, regulated environments of the early modern era. The shadow was still there, lurking in the corners of the world, but for the first time, mankind was no longer just a victim, it was becoming a strategist. Now, let the image of those lonely island outposts and the quiet, sun-bleached walls of the lazarettos fade into the mist of the past. The fear of the traveler and the isolation of the stranger are long gone, replaced by the interconnectedness and safety of your modern world.
The heavy gates of the quarantine stations have been opened for centuries, and the air is now free and clear. Feel the immense space of the night around you, not as a void, but as a peaceful, protective lair. You are not confined or isolated. You are simply resting in the quiet heart of a world that learned how to protect itself. Let the rhythmic sound of the distant sea carry away any remaining tension in your limbs. Your sanctuary is private, warm, and secure. As you sink into the depths of your bed, the organized structures of history dissolve into the soft, formless comfort of sleep. You are safe, the world is at rest, and the night is yours to enjoy in total, undisturbed tranquility.
The red crosses would appear on doors, and the markets would fall silent.
However, with each recurrence, the shock became a grim routine. People developed a plague culture, a stoic resilience that influenced everything from their poetry to their laws. They learned that the shadow could return at any moment, and this uncertainty fueled a desperate, vibrant desire to live fully in the present. The plague had become a permanent resident of the human story, a silent teacher of the fragility and preciousness of every single day. Now, let the image of those recurring shadows and the tolling bells of the past soften into the background of your consciousness. The long centuries of uncertainty have long since settled into the stable, protected reality of the present. The cycle of fear has been broken, and the air you breathe is filled with the calm certainty of safety. Feel the heavy, comforting weight of your blankets as they anchor you to this moment of absolute peace. The lessons of the past are stored away, leaving you with nothing to do but surrender to the stillness of the night. As the flickering torchlight of history fades into the cool, dark velvet of sleep, allow your mind to drift away from the world of cycles and waves. You are in a safe harbor, far from the storms of time, where the only movement is the slow, rhythmic tide of your own rest. A new horizon. The departure of the plague left behind a world that was physically emptier, but intellectually transformed. The massive demographic vacuum created by the Black Death acted as a catalyst for the Enlightenment, as the survivors realized that neither blind faith nor ancient tradition could protect them from the forces of nature. The great silence of the 17th century eventually gave way to the hum of the Industrial Revolution, as the scarcity of human labor, a problem that had plagued the West since 1348, was finally solved by the invention of the machine. The memory of the pestilence became a ghost story, a mythic shadow used to remind humanity of its mortality. But the scars remained embedded in our very DNA. Scientists now know that the survivors of those dark centuries passed on specific genetic traits that shaped the immune systems of modern humans. We are, in a very literal sense, the children of the survivors. We carry the resilience of those who endured the end of the world. The plague taught us that civilization is a fragile tapestry, but it also proved that the human spirit possesses an inexhaustible capacity to rebuild, to innovate, and to find beauty in the aftermath of despair. The story of the Black Death is not just a chronicle of death, but a testament to the enduring power of life to reclaim the earth. Now, let the vast, sweeping narrative of these centuries finally come to a rest. The grand movements of history, the rise and fall of empires, and the long struggle against the invisible are all settled now, resting quietly in the archives of the deep past. The world outside is still, and the air in your room is calm and protective. There is no more history to witness tonight, and no more paths to walk. Feel the absolute stillness of your limbs as they merge with the softness of your bed, anchored by the weight of a peaceful, final silence. The echoes of the past have vanished, leaving only the tranquil, slow heartbeat of the present. You have journeyed through the darkest chapters of the human story and emerged into the safe, warm light of your own sanctuary. Let your mind become a clear, dark mirror, reflecting only the serenity of the night. As you surrender to the deep, heavy pull of sleep, know that the world is at peace, the story is complete, and you are free to drift into a dreamless, perfect oblivion. Though the active threat of the plague dissolved into the mists of time, it left behind a silent language written in the very landscape of our world. If you look closely at the old cities of Europe today, the memory of the 1340s is still etched into the stone. The narrow, winding alleys that were once veins of infection have become picturesque pathways, and the massive stone gargoyles on cathedrals remain as frozen sentinels of an era that stared directly into the eyes of the abyss. In the quiet corners of rural England and France, the ridge and furrow patterns in the earth, undulations of soil that haven't been plowed since the village was abandoned 600 years ago, stand as a physical braille of a lost population. These are the whispers of the archives, reminding us that every modern street we walk upon and every foundation we build sits atop the resilience of those who came before. The void left by the Black Death was eventually filled with music, art, and a new philosophy of humanism. But the silence of the vacant spaces always remained a part of the cultural soul. We learned that to remember is to honor, and that the story of humanity is one of constant rhythmic oscillation between shadow and light. This final reflection brings us to the ultimate understanding. The plague did not just take from the world,